3 weeks ago, under a ceiling of crystal chandeliers and rehearsed applause, I stopped being the Marlowe family's favorite joke. My name is Jules Marlowe. I'm 29 years old, and until that night at my stepfather's black tie legacy gala in Charleston, I had perfected the art of swallowing humiliation whole. The ballroom overlooked the harbor, all ivory drapes and gold uplighting, with a jazz trio playing something smooth and forgettable in the corner. 200 guests milled about in tuxedos and designer gowns, holding champagne flutes like props in a theater production about generosity and power. My stepfather, Gordon Marlowe, founder and CEO of Marlowe Health Network, loved events like this. He loved the stage, the spotlight, the illusion of benevolence. The gala was meant to celebrate his legacy, decades of expanding hospitals and clinics across the Southeast. There were banners printed with his face, a video montage of ribbon cuttings, testimonials from grateful board members. It was a shrine disguised as a fundraiser. I almost didn't go. The invitation had arrived in thick cream cardstock with gold embossed lettering. Gordon Marlowe requests the pleasure of your company. The phrasing made me laugh out loud when I opened it in my kitchen. Pleasure. As if my presence had ever been considered that. But something in me knew I needed to be there. I told myself it was closure. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a quiet instinct that the night would reveal something final. I wore a black silk dress, simple, structured, deliberate. No dramatic jewelry, no borrowed sparkle, just a thin gold bracelet that had belonged to my mother and a pair of heels that made my spine straighten on instinct. I arrived alone. No one greeted me at the entrance. The event coordinator glanced at her tablet, checked my name, and directed me toward a table near the back of the ballroom. Not with family. Not with board members. Just far enough away to be decorative but not distracting. I expected nothing else. From across the room, I watched Gordon move from cluster to cluster, clapping shoulders, laughing too loudly, accepting praise like oxygen. Celeste floated beside him in a silver gown that shimmered every time she turned her head. Trent, of course, was magnetic in that effortless way he'd always had, shaking hands, leaning in close to donors, already being referred to as the future of the network. I could almost script the conversations without hearing them. Trent's vision is remarkable. He's just like his father. The Marlowe name is in good hands. I sipped champagne and let the invisibility settle around me like a familiar coat. The program began just after 9. Lights dimmed, the jazz trio faded. A spotlight hit the stage. Gordon stepped up to the podium with the ease of a man who has never been questioned in his own house. He started with gratitude. Staff, physicians, community partners. He told polished stories about expanding rural clinics and navigating storm seasons. The crowd responded exactly as trained. Applause on cue, laughter at the right beats. He thanked Celeste for her unwavering support. The camera cut to her dabbing her eyes delicately. More applause. He introduced Trent as the next generation of leadership, a standing ovation. Then, inevitably, his gaze found me. And of course, he said, voice warm and theatrical, we have Jules. A spotlight shifted. It took a second for me to realize it was centered on my table. He smiled that smile, the one that reads charming from a distance and cutting up close. Jules has always marched to her own drum. No diploma, no direction, just a talent for showing up when the bar is open. The pause that followed was intentional, perfectly timed. Laughter rolled across the ballroom in thick waves. Comfortable laughter. The kind people give when they believe they're participating in harmless humor. I felt 200 pairs of eyes swing toward me, some curious, some pitying, some relieved it wasn't them. My body didn't react the way it might have 10 years ago. I didn't feel heat crawl up my neck. I didn't feel tears threaten. Instead, I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest, a clarity I hadn't known I was waiting for. I stood slowly. The laughter faltered almost immediately. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. I lifted my champagne flute toward the stage, toward Gordon, toward the chandeliers and the banner with his face printed larger than life. Cheers, I said, my voice carrying further than I expected. This is the last time any of you will ever see me. Silence fell like a curtain. Not dramatic silence, not theatrical, real silence. I set the glass down without taking a sip. I picked up my clutch. I didn't rush. I didn't look back at Celeste's frozen smile or Trent's confusion or Gordon's flicker of disbelief. I walked straight down the aisle between tables, my heels striking the hardwood floor in deliberate rhythm. Each step felt like punctuation. Behind me, I could feel the room trying to breathe again, unsure whether to resume the program or pretend nothing had happened. The ballroom doors opened with a soft whoosh, and cooler night air wrapped around me as I stepped onto the hotel terrace overlooking the harbor. The soundproof glass muted whatever chaos might have followed inside. For the first time all evening, I exhaled fully. I didn't know yet what consequences would ripple outward from that moment. I didn't know about the phone calls that would flood my screen the next morning, or the panic that would travel up and down the Marlowe Health Network boardroom within days. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done letting them narrate my life. As I crossed the valet lane toward my car, the golden light of the ballroom glowing behind me like a stage I'd finally exited for good, I realized something almost startling. He thought he had humiliated me. What he'd actually done was give me permission to leave. I didn't drive straight home that night. Instead, I pulled over along the marina a few blocks from the hotel and turned off the engine. The harbor was quiet except for the faint clinking of sailboat masts and the distant hum of traffic. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, almost eerily calm. I kept waiting for the delayed reaction, for the shaking, the tears, the humiliation to crash in now that I was alone. But it didn't come. What came instead was something sharper and cleaner. Resolve. My phone started buzzing before I even put it into drive again. First Celeste, I let it ring. Then Trent, then Gordon. 3 calls in less than 2 minutes. I silenced the phone and stared out at the dark water. I could picture the ballroom behind me, confused whispers, donors exchanging glances, someone attempting to restart the program while Gordon recalibrated his smile. He would frame it as a misunderstanding, a daughter being dramatic. He would never allow the narrative to slip from his control. That was his true gift, not healthcare expansion, not leadership. Narrative control. By the time I got back to my townhouse in Savannah, 2 hours down the coast, the messages had started. Call me immediately. What the hell was that? You embarrassed this family. We need to discuss your behavior. Not one said, are you okay? I showered, washed the scent of hotel perfume and polished wood off my skin, and crawled into bed without responding to anyone. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, the second wave hit. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly expressing concern. A former neighbor saying she'd heard I'd had some sort of breakdown at the gala. A board member's wife texting me, families can be complicated, sweetie. Pride goes both ways. It didn't take a genius to see what was happening. Gordon was shaping the story before anyone else could. I wasn't a woman who'd calmly walked away from public disrespect. I was unstable, emotional, difficult. By Monday afternoon, the calls shifted in tone. A number I didn't recognize appeared on my screen with a Charleston area code. I answered out of curiosity. Miss Marlowe, this is Daniel Keene from Marlowe Health Network Operations. His voice was polished, cautious. I understand there may be some confusion about your association with Tide Glass Analytics. There it was. For years, I had built Tide Glass carefully, deliberately keeping my personal name separate from the company's public identity. Our contracts were clean. Our work spoke for itself. I had never once leveraged the Marlowe connection for business. In fact, I'd worked hard to ensure it couldn't be traced back to me easily. Confusion? I asked evenly. There are rumors, he continued, that you may have some ownership stake in Tide Glass. We were hoping to clarify that. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, so the threads were being pulled. I'm not sure why that would concern you, I replied. Well, he hesitated, given the timing of recent events. Recent events. As if humiliation was a board memo. I'll have my legal counsel reach out if necessary, I said, and ended the call. I didn't need to wait for confirmation. They were digging, which meant the time for quiet invisibility was over. That afternoon, I scheduled an emergency meeting with my attorney and my COO. We gathered in our small but sharp conference room overlooking the Savannah River. The Tide Glass logo, clean, minimal, professional, was etched on the glass wall behind them. I remember feeling oddly grounded by it. Walk me through the contract again, I said. 30-day termination clause, no cause required, no financial penalty. We'd built redundancy into our client portfolio over the last year, precisely because I'd never trusted dependency on anyone. Marlowe Health Network represented a significant account, yes, but not a fatal one. Losing them would sting. It wouldn't sink us. The room was quiet for a moment. "Are you certain?" my COO asked carefully. "This will escalate things." "It already has," I said. And that was the truth. I didn't draft the termination letter in anger. I didn't slam a fist or pace the floor. I approached it the same way I approached a disaster response plan. Identify the risk, implement the strategy, execute cleanly. Monday morning at 9 a.m., Tideglass Analytics sent a formal notice to Marlowe Health Network citing strategic repositioning and portfolio realignment. 30 days. No emotion, no commentary. Then I drafted a second letter. Personal, short. I told Gordon the truth, that Tideglass was mine, that for 3 years, the daughter he dismissed had been strengthening his empire, that I wasn't ending the contract for revenge, but for boundary, and that he was not to contact me again. By 10:15 a.m., my phone lit up like a storm warning. Missed calls, texts escalating from outrage to panic within minutes. "Is this some kind of joke? You are jeopardizing hundreds of jobs. You have no idea what you're doing." I didn't answer. At 1:40 p.m., my assistant stepped into my office. "Jules, there are 3 people here demanding to see you." Of course they had driven down personally. Gordon didn't tolerate waiting when control was slipping. I told her to put them in the glass conference room. When I walked in, the shift in power was tangible. Gordon looked older than he had at the gala. Celeste's posture was rigid, lips tight. Trent radiated anger barely contained. "This is absurd," Gordon began before I even sat down. "You don't understand the ramifications." "I understand them perfectly," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. Trent leaned forward. "Do you realize hurricane season starts in 8 weeks? Your systems are integrated across 3 facilities. Pulling out now is reckless." I held his gaze calmly. "No, mocking your daughter publicly and assuming she'd keep protecting you was reckless." Silence. For the first time in my life, I watched Gordon struggle to adjust his tone. "If you were hurt," he said stiffly, "we can discuss that. But business is business." "Exactly. Business is business," I agreed, "which is why this decision is final." Celeste tried a softer approach. "Jules, families argue. You don't dismantle livelihoods over feelings." I almost smiled. "You dismantled mine 10 years ago," I said quietly. Gordon's jaw tightened. "If you proceed with this, don't expect anything further from this family." I leaned back in my chair. "You still think I'm negotiating for inheritance," I said. "I'm not." I slid a copy of Vivian's trust documents across the table. She ensured I never had to. And for the first time, I saw something crack, not pride. Control. When they left my office that afternoon, they did so without another threat. Because the one thing they understood better than anyone else was leverage. And for once in my life, it wasn't theirs. The fallout didn't explode overnight. It unraveled slowly, like a seam coming loose in a tailored suit. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. 30 days sounds generous on paper. In reality, it's a countdown. Every sunrise after that termination notice felt like a quiet tick echoing somewhere far away in Charleston boardrooms. I didn't monitor Marlowe Health Network obsessively. I had my own company to run, my own clients depending on me. But Savannah and Charleston share more than coastline. They share gossip. Word drifted down the river like debris after a storm. First, there were rumors that the network's emergency preparedness team had scrambled to secure a replacement analytics firm. The problem was, what Tideglass had built wasn't a plug-and-play system. It was customized, integrated, layered into vendor contracts, staffing software, supply chain routing. We hadn't just offered advice, we had engineered infrastructure. 2 weeks into the 30-day window, I got an email from a former hospital administrator I respected. It was polite, but pointed. "I heard Tideglass is disengaging from Marlowe Health. I hope this wasn't avoidable. Their hurricane modeling has relied heavily on your projections." That word, relied, sat with me. Reliance is a dangerous thing when it's built on disrespect. By week 3, the tone of incoming messages from Charleston shifted from indignant to urgent. I still wasn't answering Gordon's calls, but I did listen to one voicemail out of curiosity. His voice was tight, carefully controlled. "You're overestimating your leverage," he said. "The board is not pleased. This could get messy." I almost admired the phrasing. Not, this is hurting us. Not, we made a mistake. Just an implied threat wrapped in corporate caution. I deleted the voicemail, then the press release hit. Marlow Health Network announces strategic operational restructuring. It was the kind of statement written by people who believe euphemism is a shield. Market recalibration, resource reallocation, temporary adjustments. What it meant in plain language was this: they were laying off staff, delaying expansion projects, freezing vendor contracts. I didn't feel triumphant when I read it. I felt tired. A week later, Savannah's local business journal ran a short piece analyzing the sudden instability at Marlow Health. It mentioned the unexpected departure of a key analytics partner. It didn't name Tide Glass directly, but anyone who knew the industry could connect the dots. My phone buzzed again, this time from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Aunt Lila. My mother's sister had always lived on the periphery of my life, close enough to know the tension, far enough to avoid direct conflict with Gordon. Her voice, when I answered, sounded older than I remembered. "I saw the article," she said quietly. "You finally did it." "Did what?" I asked. "Stopped letting him write your story." There was a pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end. "There's something you deserve to know," she added. I braced myself. "Your mother set up an education fund before she died, specifically for you. It was protected, structured so no one could touch it without explicit conditions." My chest tightened. "Gordon accessed it after the funeral," she continued, "claimed it was necessary for family liquidity. Vivian fought him. That's why she created that separate trust for you later. She couldn't undo what he'd taken." The room felt smaller suddenly, so when he said there wasn't money, I began. "There was," Lila said softly. "There always was." After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at the Tide Glass logo etched into the glass wall. For years I'd suspected favoritism. I'd suspected dismissal. But this was different. This wasn't indifference. This was deliberate. It reframed everything: the family meeting, the cold efficiency with which my education had been cut off, the subtle way I'd been positioned as less valuable. It wasn't that they didn't believe in me. It was that they believed in Trent more, and they were willing to redirect my future to fund his. I expected rage to flare up. Instead, what came was clarity. A hard, clean line between who they were and who I was becoming. A few days later, I heard through a mutual industry contact that the Marlow Health Board had called Gordon back in for transitional oversight. Retirement, it seemed, had become less celebratory and more corrective. Trent's leadership was being evaluated. I didn't celebrate that either. Revenge had never been the point. Boundary was. But there's a strange quiet that follows truth. It echoes. It exposes. One afternoon, about 2 months after the gala, I ran into Daniel Keene, the operations director who had called me weeks earlier, at a regional infrastructure conference in Jacksonville. He looked uncomfortable, but approached anyway. "I won't pretend this hasn't been difficult," he said carefully, "but I have to ask, did you plan this? The timing with the gala?" I studied him for a moment before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I planned to keep doing my job. He planned to humiliate me. Everything else followed from that." He nodded slowly, as if recalibrating his understanding of the narrative. "That's not the version circulating," he admitted. "Of course it's not." We stood there in silence for a beat. "You built something impressive," he added quietly before walking away. That was the first acknowledgement that felt clean. Back in Savannah, Tide Glass continued to grow. We secured 2 new municipal contracts and expanded our disaster response modeling into coastal Alabama. Diversification, stability, no dependency on a single legacy name. But the internal work, that took longer. I started seeing a therapist in early spring, not because I was unraveling, but because I realized I had spent a decade proving something to people who had already decided who I was. Therapy wasn't about reliving the gala. It was about untangling the need to be exceptional, just to feel equal. "Do you hate them?" my therapist asked in our 3rd session. I thought about Gordon's face in the conference room, about Celeste's trembling performance, about Trent's flash of fear. "No," I said finally. "Hate would mean I'm still tied to them. What do you feel?" Done. And that was the truth. The Marlow name still circulates in Charleston. It probably always will. Legacies don't vanish overnight. But I no longer flinch when I hear it. Because here's what I learned in the months after I walked out of that ballroom. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to expose someone, it's to stop protecting them. And when you stop protecting people who built their power on your silence, the cracks appear all on their own. By the time summer settled over the coast, thick and humid and relentless, the Marlowe crisis had shifted from rumor to case study. I didn't have to search for updates anymore. They arrived uninvited. Articles analyzing leadership instability, industry chatter about legacy executives who fail succession planning, panels at conferences where Gordon's name was referenced indirectly, never accused outright, just studied as a cautionary tale. It was strange watching the mythology of him thin out in real time. But the real shift didn't happen in headlines. It happened in silence. The calls stopped. The texts stopped. No more indirect warnings from cousins. No more veiled threats from Trent. No more attempts at emotional leverage from Celeste. For the first time in my life, the Marlowe household wasn't echoing in my periphery. It was just quiet. And quiet, I discovered, can be disorienting when you've lived your whole life bracing for noise. One evening in late July, I drove back to Charleston alone. Not for them, for me. I parked near the harbor where I'd sat the night of the gala and walked along the waterfront under a sky streaked pink and gold. Tourists laughed near the pineapple fountain. A couple posed for engagement photos by the water. Life continued, indifferent to legacy and scandal. I passed the hotel where the gala had been held. The banners were gone, replaced by advertisements for a medical symposium. The revolving doors spun as if nothing significant had ever happened inside. For a moment, I stood across the street and imagined a different version of that night. A version where Gordon had simply introduced me as his stepdaughter. A neutral acknowledgement. No joke, no cruelty, no applause at my expense. Would I still have left? I think I would have, because the gala wasn't the cause. It was the confirmation. I'd been carrying a fracture for 10 years. That night just made it visible. Back in Savannah, Tideglass was preparing for peak storm season. My team was sharp, focused, capable. I'd hired a new project manager, Elena Morales, who challenged my decisions in meetings without hesitation. The first time she did it, my instinct was to brace for dismissal, the way I used to when I contradicted Gordon. Instead, I found myself smiling. "This is why I hired you," I told her. Pushback. Building a company where dissent was welcome felt like quiet rebellion against everything I'd grown up with. In August, I received an unexpected email from Vivian's former attorney, Nina Calder. Subject, personal item. Inside was a scanned copy of a handwritten note Vivian had left tucked inside a file labeled Jules for later. My dearest Jules, if you're reading this, it means you finally stopped waiting for permission. I won't pretend the road will be smooth once you choose yourself. People rarely forgive you for stepping outside the role they assigned you. But remember this, you were never meant to be small, just to make others comfortable. I saw your strength long before you did. Use it wisely, not cruelly, and don't let success harden you. Stay kind, but not at your own expense. Love always. Vivian, I read it 3 times before closing my laptop. Not cruelly. That line stayed with me. Because the truth was, I had leverage. I had information about the education fund Gordon had drained. I had documentation of internal emails from years ago that painted a far less benevolent picture of family decisions. If I wanted to, I could have made things far more public than they already were. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, because I didn't need to. A few weeks later, I ran into Trent unexpectedly at a coastal infrastructure summit in Atlanta. He looked leaner, sharper around the edges, like the months had carved something out of him. He spotted me near the registration desk and hesitated before walking over. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "It's an industry conference," I replied calmly. "This is my industry." He nodded once, almost reluctantly acknowledging the truth of that. "We're restructuring?" he said after a beat. "New consultants, smaller scale." I heard. Silence stretched between us, not hostile but unfamiliar. "You could have destroyed us," he said finally. "You didn't." "I didn't want to destroy you," I answered. "I wanted distance." He studied me like he was seeing a version of me he'd never bothered to examine before. "For what it's worth," he added quietly, "I didn't know about the education fund." I believed him. "Believing someone deserves less doesn't require knowing every detail," I said gently. He flinched, Not from anger, but recognition. We didn't hug. We didn't reconcile. We just stood there as two adults shaped by the same house in very different ways. When he walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Therapy sessions shifted from processing anger to building forward. My therapist asked me once, "What would your life look like if the Marlowes never entered the conversation again?" The answer surprised me. Peaceful, not dramatic, not triumphant, just steady. By early fall, Tide Glass signed a multi-year contract with a Gulf Coast city expanding its flood mitigation program. It was the kind of project I dreamed about at 17 when I first told Vivian I wanted to fight rising tides instead of reputations. The night we finalized the contract, I sat alone in my office after everyone left. The river outside was calm, reflecting city lights in long silver streaks. I thought about my mother squeezing my hand twice before crossing the street. "I've got you." For years, I'd waited for someone else to squeeze back. What I finally understood was this: I could be the one who did. The Marlowe name still exists. Gordon still attends charity dinners. Celeste still curates appearances. Trent is rebuilding something quieter, less flashy. But I don't orbit them anymore. I built something real, something independent, something that doesn't require humiliation as fuel. And if there's a final lesson in all of it, it's this: walking away isn't about burning bridges. It's about realizing you were the one holding them up all along. By the time autumn edged in and the air along the river turned crisp instead of suffocating, something inside me had shifted in a way I hadn't expected. I thought walking away would feel explosive, like slamming a door hard enough to rattle the hinges. Instead, it felt gradual, like lowering a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. Tide Glass was steady. We'd weathered hurricane season with new clients along the Gulf Coast, and our predictive modeling had helped one hospital system reroute critical supplies ahead of a major storm. The email from their chief operations officer still sat in my inbox, starred, "Your team saved us weeks of chaos." Thank you. It was simple. No theatrics, no applause, just acknowledgement. That kind of validation felt different from the kind I'd spent my childhood chasing. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with chandeliers or microphones. It came quietly, earned. One Friday afternoon, as the office emptied out for the weekend, Elena knocked on my open door. "You're still here?" she asked, half teasing. "Old habits," I admitted. She leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to prove anything here, Jules." It caught me off guard, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. For years, my drive had been fueled by something sharp and unspoken. Not revenge exactly. More like defiance. I would build something undeniable. I would become so competent no one could question me. But what happens when you've already done that? When the person you were trying to prove wrong no longer matters? After Elena left, I sat back in my chair and let that question linger. Who was I building for now? The answer came slowly. Myself. A week later, I took a train up to Charleston, not to see Gordon, not to drive past the old house, but to visit my mother's grave. I hadn't been in years. For a long time, being in that city felt like stepping back into a version of myself I'd outgrown. But I was different now. The cemetery was quiet, shaded by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. I found her headstone easily. The date still startled me, how short her life had been. I knelt down and brushed leaves away from the base. "I did it," I said softly. "Not the way you planned, but I did it." There was no dramatic sign, no wind gust, no cinematic moment, just stillness. And in that stillness, I felt something settle. For so long, I'd carried the narrative that I'd failed her somehow by not finishing college, by not following the path she'd imagined for me. Finding out Gordon had taken the education fund she set aside had ignited anger. Yes, but it had also cleared something else. It hadn't been my failure. It had been his choice. Standing there, I realized something else. My life had unfolded differently, but not smaller. I hadn't become an environmental engineer the traditional way. Instead, I'd built a company that helped cities survive climate disasters. I was still fighting rising water, just from a different angle. On the train ride back to Savannah, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in months. Gordon. For a split second, muscle memory urged me to let it ring. Instead, I answered. "Jules," he said. His voice sounded older than it had at the Gala, less polished. "What do you want?" I asked calmly. There was a pause, not strategic, uncertain. "I won't take much of your time," he began. "The board is restructuring permanently. I'm stepping back fully this time." I didn't respond. "I know you don't owe me anything," he continued. "I just wanted to say I underestimated you." It wasn't a sweeping apology. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't the kind of cinematic redemption people imagine, but it was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledgement. "Underestimation isn't the same as respect," I replied evenly. Another pause. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." For a moment, I wondered if I felt vindicated. I didn't. I felt detached. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for," I said finally. "You too," he answered. We ended the call without promises, without reconciliation, without reopening anything. And strangely, that felt right. Closure doesn't always come with tears and embraces. Sometimes it comes with a neutral tone and the realization that the other person no longer has emotional leverage over you. That night, I sat on my back patio in Savannah with a glass of wine and listened to the river traffic hum in the distance. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed inside the Marlowe household. The quiet one at dinner tables, the hopeful one in Gordon's office asking about college, the furious one driving away from the gala. They all led here. I didn't regret terminating the contract. I didn't regret the confrontation. But I also didn't feel the need to push further. The truth had surfaced. The boundaries were set. The rest wasn't mine to manage. A few days later, Aunt Lila mailed me a small box. Inside was my mother's old gold bracelet, the twin to the one I wore the night of the gala. I hadn't known there were two. A note rested inside. She bought them as a pair. Said, "You'd wear one when you were strong enough to choose yourself." I slipped it onto my wrist beside the other one. Two thin bands. Simple. Unassuming. Strong. That evening, I sent an email to my leadership team outlining a new initiative, mentorship scholarships for young women entering environmental data science. Full funding for certifications and training programs. No one would have their education redirected because someone else decided they were less valuable. When Elena asked what inspired the program, I just smiled. "Long story," I said. The Marlowe name would always exist in Charleston. People would always have opinions. Some would side with Gordon. Some would quietly admire what I'd done. None of it mattered anymore. Because here's what I finally understood. Freedom isn't loud. It's not revenge. It's not even victory. It's waking up one morning and realizing that the people who once defined your limits no longer occupy space in your decisions. I didn't burn their house down. I just stopped living in it. And that has made all the difference. By winter, the air along the Savannah River had turned sharp and metallic, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter and breathe a little deeper. The holidays were approaching, my first season without even the illusion of obligation to Charleston. No formal dinners, no stiff smiles in rooms full of curated generosity, no calculating where I should sit to be least inconvenient. For the first time in my adult life, I had to decide what I wanted the holidays to look like. That question felt bigger than it should have. When you grow up in a house where appearances are currency, traditions become performance. Christmas at the Marlowes had always been immaculate. Custom wreaths, coordinated outfits, a tree that looked professionally styled. Gifts were expensive and impersonal. Gratitude was expected, not felt. There was always a photographer, always a carefully drafted holiday card sent to donors and executives, as if family itself were a brand asset. I hadn't realized how much tension I carried around that season until it wasn't there. Instead of driving north, I hosted a small dinner at my townhouse. Elena came. 2 analysts from Tide Glass who didn't have family nearby joined us. Aunt Lila even drove down from Charleston with a pie she insisted was too big for one person. We crowded around my dining table with mismatched plates and too much food. No one was performing. No one was curating an image. At one point, Alina raised her glass and said, "To building the life you want instead of the one assigned to you." The words hit me in a way that applause never had. Assigned to you. That's exactly what the Marlowe household had done. Assigned roles. Trent, heir. Celeste, polished partner. Gordon, benevolent patriarch. And me? Decorative liability, convenient punchline. I excused myself halfway through dinner and stepped out onto the patio for air. The night was cold, stars scattered thin across the sky. I thought about how easy it would be, even now, to slip back into that orbit if I wanted to. One apology, one softened boundary, one let's move forward dinner. But the cost of that return would be myself. And I had finally grown too expensive to trade. In January, something unexpected happened. Tide Glass was invited to present at a National Resilience Summit in Washington, D.C. Our Gulf Coast modeling project had drawn attention. The invitation was addressed directly to me, not executive team, not operations lead, me. For years, I'd kept my name deliberately muted, protecting both my independence and my privacy. But standing in my office with that invitation in hand, I felt a quiet shift. Hiding had been strategic once. Now it felt unnecessary. I accepted. When I stepped onto that stage in D.C., there were no chandeliers or smug laughter. Just professionals, policymakers, engineers. I spoke about predictive infrastructure modeling, about designing systems that don't collapse under pressure. I spoke about risk mitigation, not just for cities, but for leadership structures. Over-reliance on a single point of control creates fragility, I said during the Q&A. Distributed strength builds resilience. The metaphor wasn't subtle. After the panel, a young woman approached me. She looked nervous but determined. I almost dropped out of my program last year, she admitted. Funding fell through. Seeing you up there, it helps. It helps. That was it. That was the impact. Not proving someone wrong, not reclaiming a narrative, helping someone stay. That night in my hotel room, I stared at the city lights outside the window and thought about the education fund my mother had set aside. The one Gordon had quietly redirected. For so long, that betrayal had felt like a theft of opportunity. Now, I saw it differently. It had delayed me. It had not diminished me. And in some strange way, the path I was forced onto had sharpened me in ways the original one might not have. When I returned to Savannah, I expanded the scholarship initiative we'd started. We partnered with 2 community colleges along the coast, full funding for certifications, paid internships at Tide Glass, mentorship built in, not as charity but as investment. The first recipient, a 19-year-old named Mariah, showed up to her interview clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. She reminded me painfully of myself at that age, hopeful, cautious, bracing for dismissal. You don't have to prove you belong here, I told her gently. Her eyes welled slightly. No one had ever said that to me at 19. One afternoon in late February, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email, not a corporate memo. A letter. It was from Gordon. The handwriting was stiff, unfamiliar without a signature line beneath it. Jules, I've had time to reflect. Leadership built on control isn't leadership. I won't pretend I understood that before. I'm not asking for reconciliation. I'm acknowledging that I failed you in ways that mattered. No justifications, no bargaining, no strategic phrasing, just acknowledgement. I read it twice and placed it in a drawer. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I felt neutral, which, in its own way, was the most significant shift of all. Because neutrality meant he no longer had access to my emotional temperature. Spring edged closer. The river softened. Tide Glass secured a multi-state coastal infrastructure contract that would anchor us for years. The team celebrated with takeout and cheap champagne in the office. No photographers, no curated speeches. As the laughter echoed through the conference room, I caught my reflection faintly in the glass wall, older than the girl who had sat under chandeliers swallowing humiliation. Stronger, steadier. I thought about something my therapist had asked months earlier. If you remove them from the story, she'd said, "Who are you?" Now I knew. I am a builder, not of legacy names, not of fragile empires, but of systems that hold under pressure. And if there's one final truth I've come to understand in this chapter of my life, it's this. Walking away wasn't the climax. It was the beginning. Because once you stop surviving someone else's version of you, you finally get to author your own. By the time my 30th birthday approached, the word legacy no longer made my chest tighten. For most of my life, legacy had meant Gordon, his speeches, his empire, his obsession with how history would frame him. But somewhere in the months after I walked out of that ballroom, the word had changed shape for me. It stopped meaning reputation. It started meaning impact. I didn't plan anything elaborate for my birthday. No gala, no curated guest list. I rented a small beach house on Tybee Island for the weekend and invited a handful of people who felt real. Elena, Mariah, Aunt Lila, 2 colleagues who'd been with Tide Glass since the beginning. The house was weathered and sun-bleached, with wide windows that let in too much light and the constant hum of the ocean. It was imperfect in a way that felt honest. On the first night, We sat on the back deck, wrapped in blankets while the tide rolled in and out under a silver moon. Someone passed around a bottle of wine. Mariah asked how Tide Glass started, and for the first time, I told the whole story without flinching at the painful parts. Not dramatically, not as a confession, just as fact. When I was 19, my education was cut short, I said. I thought it was the end of my trajectory. It wasn't. It just forced me to build one myself. Elena looked at me thoughtfully. Do you ever wish it had been easier? The question hung in the salt air. Sometimes, I admitted. But if it had been easier, I might have built something comfortable instead of something resilient. Resilient. That word had become my quiet compass. The next morning, I woke before everyone else and walked down to the shoreline. The sand was cool, the horizon soft with early light. I let the water lap at my ankles and thought about the different versions of myself that had stood at different edges. At my mother's grave, outside the Gala doors, in my office across from Gordon. Each time I had been standing at a threshold, and each time I had stepped forward. Around noon, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. Charleston area code. For a second, old instincts stirred, bracing, calculating. I answered. The voice was unfamiliar but older. This is Robert Hale. I sit on the Marlowe Health Board. I waited. I wanted to reach out personally, he continued. There's been a vote. Gordon is fully stepping down. The board is restructuring governance to prevent concentrated executive control in the future. I almost laughed at the irony. Distributed strength builds resilience. The metaphor I'd offered on stage months ago was now being implemented inside the very institution that had once dismissed me. That sounds like a responsible decision, I said evenly. There was a pause. For what it's worth, he added, your handling of the contract termination was professional. You didn't weaponize it. That was noted. After we hung up, I stood there staring at the horizon, the ocean stretching out wide and indifferent. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Later that afternoon, while everyone napped or read inside, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table overlooking the water. I drafted a letter, not to Gordon, not to the board, but to myself. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't meant to be shared. It was a record. You survived invisibility. You survived dismissal. You survived humiliation. And you did not become cruel in response. That last line mattered most, because there had been moments, quiet, private moments, when cruelty would have been easy. When exposing every financial maneuver, every internal email, every calculated decision would have felt satisfying. But I hadn't. Not because I lacked ammunition, because I refused to let my character be shaped by someone else's worst instincts. That evening, we built a small bonfire on the beach. Someone brought out a cake from the local bakery, lopsided frosting, 30 candles that leaned in different directions. As they sang off-key and loud, I felt something swell in my chest that had nothing to do with proving anything. Belonging, not assigned, not conditional, chosen. After everyone went to bed, I stayed by the dying fire alone. The embers glowed faintly, red and steady. I thought about the bracelet on my wrist, the twin gold bands my mother had bought, the ones Aunt Lila sent after everything surfaced. I ran my thumb over them absent-mindedly. There was a time when I believed strength meant being untouchable, unbreakable, emotionally distant, but the truth was quieter. Strength was answering Gordon's call without shaking. Strength was ending a contract without malice. Strength was building scholarships so someone else wouldn't face the same theft of opportunity. Strength was letting the Marlowe name exist without needing to correct it. A week after the beach trip, I received one final piece of news from Charleston. Marlowe Health Network would be partnering with a consortium of smaller analytics firms rather than consolidating under a single consultant again, a structural safeguard against overdependence. I read the article and smiled faintly. The system had adapted, and so had I. That night, as I locked up the Tide Glass office and stepped into the cool spring air, I realized something that would have stunned the girl at 19 sitting in Gordon's office staring at his diplomas. I wasn't the afterthought. I wasn't the casualty of someone else's ambition. I was the architect of my own foundation. And for the first time, the word legacy belonged to me. Not as a monument, not as a banner in a ballroom, but as a quiet ripple of change extending outward from choices I'd made. Walking away had been an act of survival. Everything since had been an act of authorship. And I was no longer writing in reaction. I was writing on purpose. A year after the gala, I found myself back in Charleston. Not because I was summoned, not because I was cornered, but because I chose to be there. The invitation this time wasn't embossed in gold. It was a simple email from the Coastal Resilience Council asking me to keynote their annual summit. The event was being held at the same waterfront hotel where Gordon had once stood under chandeliers and turned me into a punchline. When I saw the venue listed, I sat very still. For a moment, the memory flickered, the laughter, the spotlight, the silence as I walked out. Then it faded. I accepted the invitation. The ballroom looked different without banners bearing a man's face, no legacy montage, no curated mythology, just rows of chairs, engineers, city planners, nonprofit leaders, students, people who were there to learn, not to applaud a brand. When I stepped onto the stage, there was no sharpness in my chest, no sense of confrontation. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but they no longer felt oppressive. They were just lights. I began with data. Coastal flooding projections, infrastructure vulnerabilities, adaptive modeling. I talked about building systems that don't collapse when one component fails. I spoke about distributed authority and transparent governance, about how fragile structures often look the most polished from the outside. Halfway through, I paused. There's a misconception, I said, scanning the room, that resilience is about strength. It's not. It's about flexibility. It's about designing systems that can absorb shock without breaking. And sometimes that means walking away from structures that were never designed to hold you. The room was quiet, attentive. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to. After the keynote, a line formed near the stage. Students with questions. City officials requesting follow-ups. A young woman, maybe 19, stood off to the side, waiting her turn. She looked nervous. When you said walking away, she began once we were face-to-face, did you mean leaving jobs? Or people? Both, I answered gently. If staying requires shrinking. She nodded slowly, like something had just clicked into place. As the ballroom emptied, I stayed behind for a moment. I walked to the exact spot where I'd been seated a year earlier, near the back, slightly out of view. I stood there quietly, remembering the girl who had raised a champagne glass and drawn a line in front of 200 witnesses. She had no idea how far that line would extend. Outside, the harbor looked the same, boats rocking gently, sunlight glittering across the water. I stepped onto the terrace and let the air fill my lungs. The city no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt neutral. Later that afternoon, I drove past the old Marlowe house. I hadn't planned to. My hands just turned the wheel. The iron gates were still there. The marsh grass still glowed gold in the sun. The house looked immaculate, as always. For years, that place had represented something unreachable. Approval, validation, belonging. Now it looked like architecture. Nothing more. I didn't stop the car. I didn't slow down dramatically. I just kept driving. That evening, I had dinner with Aunt Lila at a small seafood restaurant downtown. She studied me across the table, smiling softly. "You look lighter," she said. "I am," I replied. "Any regrets?" I thought about it honestly. Regret that my mother's education fund had been taken. Regret that a family could be so calculating. Regret that it took public humiliation to force clarity. But regret about walking away? "No," I said. She nodded, satisfied. Before we parted, she squeezed my hand twice, the way my mother used to before crossing the street. I froze for a second, then squeezed back. "I've got you." Driving back to Savannah that night, I reflected on the year behind me, on the contract termination, on the confrontation in the glass conference room, on the letters, the therapy sessions, the scholarships, the summit. There had been no grand revenge arc, no dramatic downfall I orchestrated. The Marlowe name still existed. Gordon still lived his life. Trent was rebuilding something quieter. Celeste continued curating appearances, but their choices no longer dictated mine. And that was enough. When I pulled into my driveway, the lights inside my townhouse were warm and steady. My phone buzzed with a message from Mariah. She'd passed her certification exam. Another from Elena about a new municipal partnership. Life moving forward. Inside, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window overlooking the river. The current flowed steadily, indifferent to human drama, carving its path over time through persistence, not force. I thought about the word that had once defined everything in my world. legacy. Gordon had tried to cement his. I had built mine differently, not in marble halls or charity galas, but in systems that hold when storms hit, in opportunities funded for women who would never have to ask permission to continue their education, in boundaries drawn without cruelty, in walking away without needing to burn the building down. Here's the truth I carry now. You don't win by humiliating someone back. You don't heal by becoming the villain in their story. You win by refusing to audition for a role you never wanted. A year ago, I stood in a ballroom and declared it was the last time they'd see me. I was right. Not because I disappeared, but because I stopped being the version of me they recognized. And in her place, I became something far stronger. Not their legacy, my own.